I'm Mike Hargrave again with Revista. Good to see everybody here. If you have friends out there, please bring them in. We've got a great talk coming up. I'm here to introduce Dr. Christopher Thornberg. Dr. Thornberg is the founder of Beacon Economics. In 2006, they're one of the nation's most respected economic research firms serving public and private sector clients across the United States. He's the former director of the UC Riverside Center for Economic Forecasting and Development and adjunct professor at the UC Riverside School of Business until 2023. He's a nationally recognized expert in economic and revenue forecasting, housing and real estate markets, labor markets, and economic policy as well. He's widely known for, get this, he's widely known for forecasting the 2007 subprime crisis, wish we'd all known him back then, and subsequent global recession, and for challenging economic narratives that diverge from the data. He's a contributor to consensus forecasts published by the Wall Street Journal, Reuters, and the National Association of Business Economics. And he's a frequent media contributor appearing on CNN, CNBC, NPR, and he's quoted regularly by the Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, and things like that. So he holds a PhD from UCLA's Anderson School of Management, and he brings unmatched data and insights to the industry. So welcome, Dr. Thornberg.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Good morning, everybody. It is very nice to be with you. They kind of asked me to come here as a little bit of a pinch hitter. I am based here in Southern California, so I realize the room's a little thin right now because I'm competing with 83 degrees and gorgeous sun. I can tell you this is not normal weather even for us. This is kind of a bizarrely warm, sunny point in our winter, so do enjoy it while you're here. I'm here, of course, to talk about what's happening in the broader economy and to discuss what that all means for commercial real estate, as well as, of course, specifically for the medical portion of the office sector as well. I have all sorts of data, and we have a lot to talk about. But before I go there, I think it's worthwhile talking a little bit about myself and my approach to thinking about things. So I started this company almost 20 years ago, and as noted, I started it in part because at the time I was working at the UCLA Forecast, and I had this weird idea that real estate was going to break and cause a big problem for the economy. My boss at the time, shall we say, had a modest disagreement with that particular prediction, and I decided it was time for me to go ahead and start my own company, and here I am 20 years later. But I still go back to that point in time because for me, it was obvious when you looked at the data that something weird was going on inside the U.S. economy, and of course, as things started to develop, I understood more and more about where these problems were. But from that point on, looking forward, I started to realize that something was weird about the economy, that how things worked was not the way I was taught back in grad school. And in particular, I was constantly challenged by this idea that the world I saw in the data was completely different than the world I saw in the headlines. Now, over time, in watching this issue, this gap, if you will, between the data and our stories become wider and wider, I've had to take a step back and think a lot about how the economy works, how choices are made. And I've done a lot of reading at different parts, if you will, about economic thinking. And my approach to this, you're going to see how I've changed my approach to thinking about the economy. You will see in full display here in the context of this talk. And it boils down to the fact that my comments today are going to be boiled around the idea of a tale of two economies. Now, as soon as you say that, again, it's the winners and losers, it's the red states, it's the blue states, it's the poor versus the rich. And no, the actual two economies, again, is the one I see in the data and the one I see in the headlines. What we think is happening, our lived experience, our social narrative, versus the objective statistical reality that I see all the time when I'm looking through this data. Now, the key here is that to really have an idea of where things are going, you have to pay attention to both of these. Because, you know, it is narratives that drive choices, the choices of policymakers, the choices of investors, the choices of consumers. But of course, it's economic reality that ultimately determines the outcome of those particular choices. In the end, good choices and smart policies start with the correct narrative, and I will tell you more and more what I see bedeviling our economy are these incredibly false narratives driving policy and choices in very odd directions. Now, I got to tell you, we have to be humble. We all stand on the shoulders of giants. And once I started thinking about the world this way, I realized I'm certainly not the first person to think about it in this particular way. In fact, one of my favorite Southern California philosophers is a guy by the name of Will Rogers, who over 100 years ago quipped, "It isn't what we don't know that gives us trouble, it's what we know that ain't so." And of course, what he's talking about yet again is false narratives. Now, let's start with the 2025 narratives. It has been an interesting year. Of course, it's been a little over a year since Donald Trump retook, if you will, his place inside the White House. And look, whatever you think of the man, he said he was going to go to D.C., shake things up, and that's exactly what he's done. It's been one of the most chaotic years I've ever experienced in my entire life. A news cycle that's moving 48 hours a day. And here's the key. That kind of volatility in the headlines is not something that folks in the economy like. And you've seen that, of course, in the collapse of consumer sentiment. You've seen a big increase in policy uncertainty. And with all this, of course, comes a litany of negative headlines. People are worried about the slow job market. There's a lot of conversations about the growing gap between the well-off and everyone else. And of course, we still have these conversations about what the tariffs are going to mean ultimately for the U.S. economy. And with this, you get the standard assortment of negative headlines. You know, for example, Mark Zandi has come out recently and pointed out that there's still an uncomfortably high chance of a U.S. economy heading into a recession this particular year. Now, I'm not sure how much I agree with that specific prediction, but that said, I also want to point out that predictions of a lot of economists over the last few years have not been the best. For example, does anyone remember back in 2019 when Zandi predicted we were going to have a housing-led recession? And by the way, this had nothing to do with the pandemic. There was supposed to be a collapse in the real estate markets back then. And in 2020, remember, the pandemic was supposed to cause a depression. 10 years of heightened unemployment and reduced, of course, economic growth, at least according to folks like Nouriel Roubini. And yet again, in 2023, there was supposed to be a recession. This one was, of course, going to be caused by the inverted yield curve, although, again, in all the years I've studied economics, no one's ever explained to me how a yield curve creates a recession, rather than, if you will, the other way around. All this, of course, reminds me of John Kenneth Galbraith's famous quip that the only function of economic forecasting is to make astrology look respectable, which at the start of my career, I got to tell you, I was a little hurt about, but right about now, I understand exactly where he's coming from. What nonsense, right? Now, with all that said, over the course of the last year or so, there's been a whole other economic narrative to pay attention to. Because if you haven't paid attention, the markets just keep going up and up and up and up. When the news is negative, the market goes up because rates are going to get cut. And when the news is positive, the market goes up because profits are going to increase. It's a one-direction phenomenon. And to give you a sense of just how dramatic this has been, particularly in tech, well, back in 2019, the market capitalization of NASDAQ was about $12.5 trillion. Today, it's about $34 trillion. That has nearly tripled in the course of 7 years. And of course, we know at the heart of all this are these massive tech stocks. Now, is this reasonable? Well, no, it's not. This is the second highest PE ratio we've ever seen in our stock markets. The only time it's been higher than it is right now was, of course, in the run-up to the dot-com bubble at the beginning of the century. And again, leading the show are these companies, Google and Amazon and NVIDIA and Microsoft, all the folks at the center, of course, at this tech and AI rush going on in the economy right now. Now, they aren't the only overvalue assets in the U.S. economy right now. We still have this thing called cryptocurrency, which, of course, has been running around $100,000. It's down a little bit right now, which I'll come back to in just a couple minutes. But again, really? I mean, think of this. Bitcoin by itself is worth a couple $1 trillion, which means Bitcoin is worth as much as Google, with, by the way, no patents, no revenues, no dividends, nothing. It's just something that sits on your laptop. And between you and me, that doesn't make any sense at all. And now, of course, cryptocurrency has been tied into the real economy through the creation of the so-called stablecoin industry with the Genius Act that allows these stablecoins to get set up, which can invest in U.S. treasuries, which all by itself is something to be concerned about, that we're attaching cryptocurrency to our government debt markets. And why would Wall Street want something like the Genius Act? Well, it's pretty obvious why. Last year, 2025, was a record year for bonuses on Wall Street. And that reminds me of the wisdom of yet another one of our, shall we say, philosopher geniuses, Warren Buffett, who said, be fearful when others are greedy. Well, right now, Wall Street's looking pretty greedy, and that means we all need to be a little bit fearful. Something odd is going on inside this economy. Now, let's start off with the basic obvious things. First and foremost, it's really not that likely that we're going to have a recession this particular year. It's just not, because there's a tremendous amount of economic momentum. Look, we started 2025 with a very weak quarter, but since then things have been picking up, and all said and done, when we come out of this particular year, 2025 is probably going to look a little bit better than 2024. By the way, not wildly better, per, of course, the recent op-ed penned in the Wall Street Journal by our president, but a little bit better. Debt markets remain clean, and probably most important of all, there's stimulus, more stimulus being thrown at our economy right now. The one big beautiful bill is, of course, expanding government deficits, which is inherently, of course, stimulative, at least in the short run. And the Federal Reserve has been backing off, both in terms of interest rates as well as this quantitative tightening program. All of that gives a little lump to the economy as we head into 2026. Now, does that mean there's no problems? And the answer is absolutely not. There are plenty of problems in the United States. Look, I have a very simple philosophy when it comes to thinking about recessions. Where is the imbalance? Recessions are driven by some sort of rapid shock in the structure of demand in an economy. Typically, not always, because in the case of the pandemic this wasn't true, but typically that big shock to the economy comes from some looming imbalance inside the economy. Think of the excessive amount of subprime borrowing and home building in 2005, 6, and 7. Think about the excessive amount of investment in information technology in the run-up to the turn of the century. Think about the excessive amount of investment in commercial real estate in the run-up to the 1991 downturn, and you could start to see what I'm talking about. Where is the imbalance? Well, the imbalance inside the United States is very clear. A, as already noted, we're in the midst of a massive financial bubble. But more importantly, the biggest problem we have is this federal government deficit. Now, I got it. Economists have been talking, about federal deficits for 40 plus years since the Reagan administration. But I'm going to show you some data later on that should scare you, because you need to start recognizing that it has truly turned a corner. It's different at this particular point in time. Now, the combination of these two circumstances, the financial bubble and the massive deficits, has started to create very similar signs in our economy that we saw in the run-up to the Great Recession, namely growing external imbalances. And that sign of a distended U.S. economy is the thing that worries me the most. Look, at some point in time, we're going to have to deal with a deficit. At some point in time, this financial bubble is going to pop. But where the risks start is how these things turn together. Now, what about commercial real estate? Well, it has been a very difficult few years for the commercial real estate industry. Not so much because of its own making. Look, I get it. Commercial real estate has a tendency to overbuild and overborrow. But really, most of the troubles and travails in commercial real estate over the last few years have a lot to do with how poorly national economic policy has been handled. The Federal Reserve's violent overreaction to the pandemic and then its violent overreaction to inflation has created a roller coaster ride for various parts of the real estate world that obviously have created all sorts of conniptions. And we continue to see some of the stress, the distressed sales, the increase in cap rates, the fact that there's still a lot of work going on. But with all that said, over the course of the last year and a half, with things smoothing out, with interest rates gently coming out, with credit becoming more available, your industry is starting to pick up speed. There's no doubt about it. And of course, the medical part of the office space in particular has been above most of the problems. in large part because healthcare is simply not a cyclical sector. It's as simple as that. But with all that said, real estate is absolutely at risk from these broader imbalances. Because remember, healthcare is being driven by federal spending, which is a function of that federal deficit. And of course, interest rates are going to be driven by Fed policy in the future, and what the Fed does in the face of various sorts of potential financial federal issues, well, that remains to be seen. So yes, while things look sunnier now like they do outside, we all have to pay attention to those gray clouds on the horizon, and you have to move forward with your eyes wide open, recognizing that this show is going to come to an end probably sooner than most people would like to believe. Now, there's a lot to internalize on this. I have too many slides as always. That's my hallmark, too many slides, which means I'm going to whip through them pretty quick. Now, all that said, I will tell you at the end of this, we're going to do a little Q&A, and if you'd like to get your phone out during that Q&A period, there'll be a QR code up on the screen. Get a picture of that. You can enter in your email address, and you'll get a copy of these slides, so you don't have to worry about trying to take pictures or keep up with the data or any of that kind of stuff, okay? Got that? Good. Let's go. So, as noted, 2025 started out weak with a negative first quarter of the year, but since then things have been picking up. 3.8% in Q2, 4.3% in Q3. It looks to be about 4% yet again in Q4. In other words, more than making up for the negative first quarter of the year. And overall, this year is probably going to be a little better in 2024, but not quite as good as 2023. This is an economy that looks pretty good. And with an accelerated economy, again, we contributed to that Wall Street Journal survey of forecasters. If you take a look at the January edition, you can see many of my compatriots in this survey have been backing off some of the grim pronouncements they made over the course of 2025, and they are upping their forecast for 2026. All good news. At the center of this is consumer spending. Consumer spending that, despite all the headlines that tell us something that's different, continues to grow. In fact, on a per capita basis, real consumer spending, real consumption in inflation-adjusted terms hit an all-time high in the fourth quarter of this particular year. And of course it did, because real median household incomes hit an all-time high this particular year, and real household net worth has also hit an all-time high level. Despite all the stories, of course, of how tough Americans have it, the reality is we're living the dream right now. And you can see that in restaurant sales, which are up 6% over year. And while it is true that passenger traffic has cooled off just a bit, overall revenue miles are still about as high as they've ever been. And auto sales are running at about 16 million units at an annualized pace. Good data for the economy. Healthcare consumption also continues to rise over the course. On the left-hand side is nominal consumption, that is to say actual just nominal dollars being spent on healthcare in the United States. On the right-hand side, I'm breaking it down with inflation adjustment to get a sense of things. Again, from 2013 to 2019, grew about 3.5% per year. 2019 to 2025, 3.6% per year. This is a sector that just grows and grows and grows. Obviously, things are shifting around, more in terms of specialty outpatient and home health care, medical laboratories picking up, physician services, ambulatory services, the folks who obviously sit in medical buildings, about steady at 4.2%, hospitals, dentists, nursing homes at the lower end of the curve, but everything's moving forward. The debt situation's fine, bankruptcies, foreclosures are still relatively low. Even credit card debt. We know credit card delinquencies started picking up during that inflation surge and the rise in interest rates, but over the last year, credit card delinquencies have peaked and are actually starting to come down a bit. So the market actually looks fairly good right now. The savings rate's a little bit weak, a little bit below 4% right now, but the low savings rate is not being accompanied with a big buildup in debt. On the right-hand side, this is consumer debt as a percent of disposable personal income, housing and non-housing, and those numbers are drifting now down, not up. In fact, from an overall household debt to GDP perspective, this is the lowest level of household debt we've had since the 1990s. This looks like a pretty healthy economy, at least at the surface. Labor markets have cooled. Look, we've seen almost no job growth over the course of the last 6 months, and we know there's going to be some down revisions. But the unemployment rate, while it's drifted up, is still about 4.4%. That's not a high number from any stretch of the imagination. Job openings are still normal at about 4.5%. Job layoffs, while they picked up over the course of the last couple of years, are still well below where they were at any point prior to the pandemic. And initial claims for unemployment insurance was absolutely flat over the course of the last couple of years. In other words, there doesn't seem to be any kind of severe dislocation happening inside our labor market right now. It's just really, really cold. And while the overall labor market is cold, not so much for ambulatory health care. Those employment numbers continue to go up, up, and up. They just crossed to 7 million jobs. On the right-hand side, kind of gives you a breakdown of where you're seeing the greatest growth rates inside the United States. Utah and Idaho, by the way, that's largely a function of population growth. Those are some of the fastest growing states out there. But worth noting, for example, a place like California with actual negative population growth over the last couple of years, nevertheless sees higher numbers, in part because incomes here continue to grow at a relatively steady basis. This is a healthy industry. And again, breaking it down just a little bit, California still has the most number of jobs in the sector at 940,000. Texas is number 2 at 600,000. Florida number 3 at 530,000. No particular surprise here, I'm sure. Now, what's interesting about the job numbers is as much as jobs in ambulatory healthcare have grown, the number of establishments, which means the individual business operations, has been growing faster. This to me was a fascinating little find when I was looking at the data the other day. In other words, what you're seeing out there is actually a greater growth in the number of doctor offices than there are in the number of people in the actual industry itself. In other words, there seems to be more, if you will, spreading out, more small doctor offices opening up, or perhaps our individual doctor offices are using less staff. Maybe they have more computers, more AI helping it. Whatever the case is, again, very aggressive increases in the number of ambulatory doctor offices over the course of the last couple of years, just crossing about 700,000 in the last year or so. If you want to take a look at what's happening in the healthcare industry itself, look, the job openings rate went through the roof after the pandemic. It couldn't hire anybody. They were competing in a very full labor market. Since then, it's cooled off, but still above 5%, still above where it was back in 2019. And of course, job postings for ambulatory healthcare, well, that remains above, at least according to the data we get from Lightcast, above where it was in 2019. So again, this continues to suggest strong trends within your particular industry. Now, with all the good news I just gave you, the standard comeback to this is, yeah, that's nice, but Chris, it's all aggregate statistics, and you're not accounting for the fact that it's all driven by the top 10%, and everybody else's life sucks. It's the K-shaped recovery. And again, you look at the data, and you don't see anything of the sort. On the left-hand side is nominal hourly wage growth by age level. And yes, younger folks have seen a pretty big increase in their wages over the last couple of years. Everybody's cooling off. On the right-hand side, this is earnings by gender and education. Women have seen more earnings growth over the last 5 years than men have. Less skilled people have seen more earnings growth than high-skilled people. This isn't a K-shaped recovery by any stretch of the imagination, right? And the term goes on. Now it's the new Gilded Age. That's what we live in. And I get it. When you see the hijinks of Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk on the internet, it's outrageous. And I can understand why a lot of people get upset when they see this nonsense in their face on a day-to-day basis. But this is not a new Gilded Age. Yes, there are a few people making incredible amounts of money out there. But that said, that's kind of the only similarity between this point in time and the last Gilded Age back at the end of the 1800s. You know why? Because at the end of the 1800s, you know what they didn't have, what we have today? Unemployment insurance, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, Section 8 housing, food stamps, and a litany of other federal programs. It's interesting. Take a left-hand side here. This is average gross income by household quintile. And yes, the top 5% has seen the greatest increases in their income over the last decade at 31%. But the bottom 80% are at 22%. And when you start talking about those numbers, remember those are gross income, it's not net income. You have to pay attention to the fact that there's a lot of taxes paid and a lot of benefits received, as already noted. Right now, inside the United States, there are $4.4 trillion of government transfers going into American households. $4.4 trillion. 1 out of $5 of American disposable income comes from government transfers. That's an insane amount of money. And when you start accounting for that, it's amazing how, of course, the data actually changes. On the left-hand side here, this is net income after transfers and taxes. This is a report done by the Congressional Budget Office. It's fantastic. They get great data in the CBO because they get to see stuff that I'm not allowed to legally. So they've gone through the data, they look at tax returns, and they actually come up with an estimate of what people's income is after they pay their taxes and after they receive their benefits. And it turns out the 2 quintiles of American households that have seen the biggest increase in their net income are the top quintile because, of course, they've had all those wonderful tax cuts over the last 20 years, and the bottom quintile because of all the benefit increases that we've seen in this nation over the last 20 years. So it's the top and the bottom that are out in front of the mix. Now, you might say, how do we cut taxes and increase benefits? And the answer, of course, is massive government borrowing, which is exactly where this presentation is going to get to. But when you add it all up, what you find out, of course, is that, well, the technical share of Americans in poverty is about 11%. Remember, that's based on gross incomes. Once you include taxes paid and benefits received, it turns out that the actual poverty rate in the United States is 0.5%. 0.5%. By far and away the lowest it's ever been. Now, it doesn't mean we don't have a problem. We do have a problem. But the problem isn't that households are starving, living on the street with kids who don't get anything, any health care or anything. The problem is, why do so many people still need to rely on the federal government to support them? And of course, that boils down to give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. Teach a man a fish, you feed him for a lifetime. It's education, not benefits, we need to be paying attention to. And of course, you particularly see this when it comes to health care. Whether you're talking about the official poverty rate or the supplemental poverty rate, keep in mind that neither one of these measures of quote-unquote poverty take into account Medicare and Medicaid spending, which is preposterous when you consider the trillions of dollars spent on health care for low-income families at this point in time. And you can see on the left-hand side how only a tiny fraction of health care spending comes out of pocket, less than $500 billion at this particular point in time. Private health insurance is $1.6 trillion. Medicare and Medicaid are almost $2 trillion. And because of Obamacare, 92% of Americans currently have health insurance. Yet again, not exactly this horrible world we continue to read about in the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times on a daily basis. Now, this may come unglued. We know about the ACA situation, and how this shakes up the industry remains to be seen. Because I even think that most of the Republicans realize that this thing is almost untouchable in this particular political environment, although yet again, at some point in time, we're going to have to pay the piper on this. Well, what about Gen Z? Susie Welch from NYU tells us that Gen Z and millennials are burnt out because older generations work just as hard, but they had hope. By the way, this was a real headline, I swear to God. Or you have Scott Galloway from NYU. Apparently NYU is full of horrible narratives, unsurprising. He talks about the war on the young, right? How terrible does the next generation have it? But the best article on this came from The Economist a couple months ago, where they pointed out that Generation Z is actually, believe it or not, unprecedentedly rich. According to their data, for Gen Z, born 1997 to 2012, coming into the labor market, they are currently receiving the highest wages of any cohort of people entering the labor force. And by the way, they get that money without working nearly as hard as we did. So, yeah, it's not what you think. Inflation is down for all the stories to the opposite. Inflation rates are running about 2.6% at this particular point in time. It's not the 2% target, but let's be honest, it's close enough for government work. And when you look closer, what's driving inflation? Guess what? It's not stuff that we're importing. It's insurance, it's airplanes, it's housing, it's restaurants. It is not being driven by imported products from the rest of the world. It's not what you think, not what the papers keep telling us. In fact, that should surprise you because everybody keeps talking about how terrible these tariffs have been for the U.S. economy and how American consumers are paying for these tariffs, and yet there's no increase in goods prices. Well, I've been saying this for almost a year now. Tariffs don't mean a lot to the United States because we're not a very import-intensive economy. And because we're such a large economy, we're so self-dependent for the most part, that if you're going to sell stuff here, you have to price to local markets. In other words, tariffs will have a small and long-term, a small effect that will take a while to kick in. And again, let me put this better in numbers. If you've had a 20% across-the-board tariff on everything coming in the United States, that's $600 billion tax on a $30 trillion economy. Maybe a third of that spills through to American consumers, which means the $200 billion we may pay in extra amounts for our stuff, if this happened, would amount to less than 1% of the $22 trillion of disposable personal income the households have. It's not that big of a threat. And by the way, we haven't even come close to $600 billion because every time they announce a tariff, they end up backing off. They hand out exemptions. And stuff from Mexico and Canada, as long as it meets local sourcing rules, can't be tariffed at all because of USMCA. So it just hasn't meant much. And by the way, all this will go away because the market, odds on, is saying the Supreme Court's going to blow up this use of the tariffs and it's not going to matter anyway. So no, tariffs aren't that big of a deal. Now, with all that said, what about food prices? Because all we hear about is how expensive food is. And yet, here's the data on the right-hand side. This is food spending as a share of total expenditures. And by the way, food spending is the lowest it's ever been in the United States. And spending in restaurants is growing faster than spending coming out of supermarkets. So we're so poor, we're only going to restaurants. Honestly, it's just crazy. But every time you turn around, there's another group talking about the hunger crisis, the problem with food prices. Why do they say this stuff? Well, I have my new saying, give a man a fish, you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish, you'll lose your nonprofit's funding grant. There is a poverty industrial complex, people. It's as simple as that. Now, with all this good news, look at the national mood. Gallup's poll, the percentage of people satisfied with their personal life, down below 45%. 7 out of 10 college kids say the country's on the wrong track because their new employer has told them they have to come to the office twice a week, please. 7 out of 10 parents think their kids are going to have a worse quality of life than they do, which begs the question, have you actually looked at your child's quality of life? It's just preposterous, but this is the world we live in. This is a survey from the Federal Reserve. I love this. They ask a whole bunch of people, how are you doing financially? Right? Very simple question. How are you doing financially? In 2017, 74% of people said we're doing okay, living comfortably. In 2024, 73% of the people said the same thing. That's the same number. People actually don't think they individually are doing worse than they were before. But where it gets really interesting is where they ask them, how is your local economy doing and how is the national economy doing? And look at those numbers. They're lower and falling. So understand the paradox this tells us. It says the average person in America is doing just fine, but the average person thinks the average person's doing terrible. It doesn't work like that. Look, 90% of parents think their kids are above average. It doesn't work like that. Okay? It's as simple as that. I got 2 boys. I got a 7 and a 9-year-old. Statistically, one will be a dumbass. I have to come to terms with that. For the record, it's the younger one. I'm just saying right now. Absolutely. Absolutely. He's beautiful, though. Don't worry about him. He'll be fine. Business investments are up. Profits are up. Manufacturing's doing fine, with the exception of employment. But manufacturing profits are up. Industrial production looks solid. Overall private construction spending, despite all the issues with interest rates, despite all the problems with cap rates and distressed properties, private construction just continues to go up, and up. It's up 50%, over 50% over the course of the last 6 years. Now, it's cooled off a bit over the last year. We know that. It's come down just a little bit. We have to appreciate this is nominal numbers, but better than people would expect. The office market, of course, has been front and center in terms of the challenges out there. Overall office vacancy rates are above 14%, and you can see the big decline in occupied office space. We know about the work from home, the fact that people aren't going to the office as much as they used to, and how that's changing markets, particularly larger markets, right? If you look on the left-hand side here, this is the size of the market in log terms versus vacancy rates. And it's the big markets, New York, LA, San Francisco, where you see the big increase in interest rates because of the change in the patterns of commuting. The small markets, by the way, are doing great. And you can see that not just in terms of the overall vacancy rate, but even in the change of vacancy rates over the course of the last couple of years. And again, this is driven largely by the failure of return to office. But all that says to me is not that office is dead as a category. It just tells me that in many of these cities, we need less office per worker. And by the way, we also need more housing per worker. And the story here for places like San Jose is not that office will no longer be a part of your portfolio of real estate. Of course it will be. It will continue to be the crown jewel, but you need less of it. And the thing to do is to be tearing down all office buildings in a very deliberate way and putting up condo towers, but it's amazingly hard for local governments to get out of their own way. It's not complicated. And of course, as much as you may talk about the broader office space, none of this, of course, applies to the medical space because of the ongoing increase in both medical establishments as well as medical spending. This is a space that hasn't seen any of this increase in vacancy rates. It's just not struggling with that. And you haven't even had a problem with a massive amount of overbuilding, much like you're seeing, of course, in that industrial sector. Now, with all this said, if things aren't that bad, why the big downward revisions in jobs? What's going on in our labor markets? And look, there's little doubt that part of what's going on in the labor markets is a lot of uncertainty, a lot of trepidation in different parts of the economy. And yeah, things are flat on that particular month. But that's completely different than saying the labor market is having a meltdown being driven by a collapse in demand in our economy. And as for, of course, the big overall downward revisions we're seeing in the data, well, that was something we were anticipating. We had to. Look, there's two ways of measuring jobs in the United States. One is the household survey and one is the payroll survey. Payroll survey comes from businesses. The household survey comes from, well, surveys of people. Now, the difference between those two is that the household survey will catch the self-employed, where the payroll survey will not. And on the left-hand side here, you can see how these two things are typically about 4 million people apart. That more or less reflects the number of self-employed. But look how that gap has collapsed since the recession, since the pandemic hit our economy. It doesn't make any sense because there has not been a decline in self-employed people. So when I see that gap absolutely disappearing, it tells me one of two things. We're undercounting household jobs or we're overcounting payroll jobs. Now, they just came out and explained to us, yeah, they're going to be revising payroll numbers down by about 1 million jobs once the January numbers come out. It's not a loss of 1 million jobs. They're just reducing the overall curve. But that still says there's 1.5 million too few household workers. What's going on there? Well, here's what's going on. It turns out, and this is a little weird, but we don't know how many workers are in this country. We actually don't know what our population is in this country. And we don't because there's been an enormous surge in people coming into our country in an undocumented sort of way. According to the census, over the last couple of years, net migration into the United States was about 1 million people per year. The CBO has their own estimates, and they think that in 22, 23, and 24, roughly 3 million people a year were pouring into this country. That's vastly more than the census estimate, which explains why we're undercounting household jobs and why our estimates of population are probably also too low. And by the way, as much as I appreciate that we shouldn't have millions of people coming into this country in an undocumented sort of way, I also want to point out that over the last 15 years, statistically, in an official statistical way, this nation has added about 17 million people to its labor force. Of that 17 million people, well over half were born overseas. So at one level, I understand the frustration with undocumented immigration. On the other level, as an economist, I also see the desperate need for these people to be coming here. Of course, the solution for this is to fix our legal system, and that isn't even whispered in D.C., much less being, of course, a source of serious consideration. Ergo, this is the world we live in. Now, the last couple of years, one of the reasons the economy was roaring because they were coming here and filling jobs. It was also, again, one of the reasons that Donald Trump was reelected because of the frustration with the undocumented nature of this. Now, of course, border crossings have collapsed and people seem to be leaving because, of course, of the heavy-handed behavior of ICE in many cities, according most notoriously at this point in time, Minnesota. And when you get right down to it, we can appreciate why this is taking some of the oomph out of our economy, why this is taking some of the oomph out of our labor markets. And look, I'm not so worried about deportations because honestly, what's amazing to me is how few people they've actually arrested for all the millions of dollars and crazy amount of money they spent, how few people they've actually swept up in their nets. But I will tell you that if we really do see a stop in people immigrating into this country, we are very close to peak labor force. We are very close to peak population. This is a nation that is immigrant dependent and behooves us to figure this out in the appropriate sort of way, and we're not. We're going the exact opposite direction, and that's a quintessential threat to everybody in this economy, everybody in this particular room. And understand that even H-1B visas are down, as the case may be, and right now 5.5% of people employed in the healthcare industry were born overseas. This is where a lot of these folks operate, and if they're not there, it's going to be hard for the medical sector to go ahead and hire the people they want to hire. And as far as AI goes, again, every time you turn around, there's another Luddite telling how AI is coming for your job. But again, when you look a little closer, let's be honest, it's more like that Dustin Hoffman guy back in Rain Man, okay? It's really, really good at doing a few things, and AI is really incapable of doing anything else. Look, it's very clever, it's very helpful, but it's still an office tool. No more, no less. It is not something that's going to fundamentally change the structure of our economy. And indeed, you know, it's interesting. I keep hearing about how recent graduates can't find jobs. Really? I mean, yes, it's drifting up just a little bit, but the unemployment rate's still just about 5%. That's not a high number. Ultimately, we need to worry, of course, about the lack of productivity growth we've seen in the economy over the last couple of years, because it's productivity growth that'll make up for the lack of overall labor force growth at this particular point in time. So how do narratives go astray? How do we end up with these weird opinions and things? Look, I could do a whole class on this. If you like this kind of stuff, pick up Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow, where he points out we think emotionally way more than we think deductively. And that's important because people do respond emotionally. Pick up Jonathan Haidt's brilliant book, The Righteous Mind, where he discusses how more often than not when it comes to important social issues, we are programmed to think emotionally, not deductively. And of course, you have to go to The Chaos Machine by Max Fisher, which talks about the folks who run the internet have realized the best way to keep you glued to the screen is by punching all your emotional buttons to keep you scared and angry. So this is kind of a perfect storm, but it boils down to the basic idea. We don't think as much as we think we think. It's as simple as that. And if you're wondering what this is, it's a whole bunch of people going up an escalator and do a 24-hour fitness. Think about it. And I tell you, when it comes to AI, I worry, you know, everybody keeps talking about the promise of AI in terms of productivity. I'm worried about making us more crazy, because we're already struggling with this deluge of information coming from the internet. We don't know how to sort out right from raw, true from false. Will AI help us figure it out? Or is it going to make it even harder for us to figure out what the truth is? Will the real AI stand up? And when it comes to false narratives, look, I'm not just talking about, you know, the little people in the street. The false narratives infect everybody, right up the food chain to Nobel Prize winners. I mean, consider this. Back in 2020, what happened? We had a pandemic hit the U.S. economy. Suddenly, all the brilliant economists in Washington, D.C., at the Federal Reserve, at the CBO, at the Council of Economic Advisors, this brain trust of incredibly intellectually brawny human beings, suddenly decided that pandemics caused depressions. What in the hell? No pandemic has ever caused a depression. Depressions are caused by deflation, not by pandemics. This never happened. Why would they suddenly determine this? I couldn't possibly tell you. I was one of the few guys out there going, what are you talking about? This is bizarre. But it didn't matter. And they went to town. They agreed in April of 2020, without a shred of evidence, to commit to $5 trillion of quantitative easing. Now, what happened to the pandemic in the end? Well, it's a very sharp, short shock. It cost this country about $800 billion and was completely over within 3 quarters. And yet they still dumped $5 trillion of quantitative easing with another $1 trillion of federal borrowing to deal with it. $6 trillion of stimulus to deal with an $800 billion hit to the economy. That's insanity. I mean, that's $7 of stimulus for every dollar of lost income. That caused a 40% increase in the money supply. And when you set off massive amounts of demand by handing out checks and you increase the money supply by 40%, you know what that causes? Inflation. Because inflation is a consequence of too many dollars chasing too few goods. This is not complicated, and I don't care how much Ben Bernanke, Jerome Powell, and Janet Yellen say it over and over again. Yes, quantitative easing had everything to do with inflation, period. Of course it did. Now, of course, they set off inflation, and then they had to go in the opposite direction to fight back on inflation. They cranked interest rates up. Way more significantly than cranking interest rates up, by the way, was quantitative tightening, the opposite of quantitative easing. No one talks about this. It's amazing to me. It's barely mentioned in the press, yet quantitative movements is way more impactful on the economy than moving the federal funds rate around. Look, when they jacked it up, put $5 trillion in the economy, that set things off. And then they went in the opposite direction. At one point in time, they were taking money out of the economy to the tune of $1 trillion a year. Now, they backed off a lot, and that's, again, one of the reasons why the credit markets are loosening up. Now, what does this mean, by the way, for the election last year? I mean, what's interesting about this is why did Trump so handily win? And the answer isn't that he had a mandate. Well over, about 40% of voters in the United States are not aligned to either party. Neither party has a mandate, and they will never, particularly given the dramatic rise of populism in both parties. The 40% in the middle who don't have any allegiance vote on vibe. And they voted for Trump because they were upset. What were they upset about? Inflation. Who caused inflation? This guy. And I just love this. So yes, he's the guy who got Trump reelected. Wow. And yet Trump wants him gone. Gone? You should be sending him flowers, candy, a little thank you note. What are you talking about? But that's the world we live in. And of course, you talk about consumer sentiment. Well, as soon as Trump got elected, the consumer sentiment of Republicans went up and the consumer sentiment of Democrats went down. Sentiment is not anything having to do with the real economy. It's driven by nothing but narratives. And that's something to keep in mind. And of course, now everybody's upset how terrible the economy is doing, and capitalism is taking a big hit. And of course, they just elected an avowed communist in New York City in a period of time when New York City's economy has never been healthier. And honestly, you look at this guy right here, don't kid yourself. He's exactly the same as Trump. They're both populists. That's what they're doing. They're pushing populist agendas in an age of abundance. And they're winning on that populist message. That is something everybody needs to keep in the back of your mind. Now, of course, we know that with backing off of quantitative easing, suddenly deposits are growing again, loans are starting to grow again, interest rates are coming down, it's easier to get mortgage loans, C&I loans. We know, of course, it's now easier to get commercial real estate loans, and demand for real estate loans is actually picking up just a little bit. It went into positive territory in the first quarter of this particular year. Prices are starting to pick back up in commercial real estate. There's been an increase in distressed properties. We know this. The shift in cap rates, the increase in interest rates created some distress out there, but it's handled relatively well. And now, of course, things are starting to pick up. Office space in San Francisco is starting to get picked up again, believe it or not. Yes, even in San Francisco. And commercial real estate transactions are picking up. NAIOP's commercial real estate optimism index is back into positive territory, and transactions are starting to occur again. Things look good. Things look good, right? But all this said, it depends on the overall health of the economy and the stability of things. And that, of course, is where I come into my final topic of this morning, the bubble and, of course, the deficit. Look, social narrative, there's a positive value to Bitcoin. That's weird. What's not part of the social narrative is this ridiculous federal deficit. And yes, we talk about it, but no one's really serious about it. And understand, while Americans feel like they're struggling, they feel like they're suffering, the reality is we're actually over-consuming. I know that by just looking at the trade deficit. The trade deficit is $1 trillion right now. In fact, that's the only time the trade deficit as a percent of our GDP has been larger than it is right now is in the run-up to the Great Recession, which is not exactly, if you will, a good comparison. Most of this is driven by excessive amounts of consumer spending. Why are people spending so much? And I've already mentioned this to you, because they don't have to pay taxes. Oh, We know that the government should actively intervene in the economy. Nixon said it back in the day, we're all Keynesians now, which means we don't believe in Keynesian theory. That's nonsense. What it does mean is the attitude today is that governments must intervene in economic cycles. They can't just sit back and go, hey, let the chips fall where they may. And that's what they do. On what I hear is the Keynesian cycle. The gray line is federal deficit spending. Up is more negative. The blue line, or purple line, is unemployment rate. And look how they cycle together. Unemployment goes up, deficits go up. Unemployment goes down, borrowing goes down. And that's how it should be. It goes up and down together. But notice how the reactions become more and more violent, right up to the point where a very small hit in 2020 created one of the most aggressive increases in federal deficit spending we've ever seen. And also importantly, notice how the cycle stopped in 2015. That is to say, starting in 2015, we've seen the deficit just rise in normal economic times as opposed to falling the way it normally does. 2015 is when the wheels truly came off the train. Started with Obama, went through Trump 1, continued all the way through Biden, and now, of course, we're continuing with Trump 2. This is a truly bipartisan effort, okay? Both parties are playing a role in it. The One Big Beautiful Bill just extends the trend of seeing this deficit become larger and larger over time. And to give you a concept of how big this is, if you wanted to close the federal deficit right now, you'd have to raise taxes by $15,000 for your average American household. $15,000. That's 9% of disposable income. Let that number rattle around your head. This is huge, and there's no attempt whatsoever to do anything about it. And once you realize that you have to account for this, you see that these statistics look completely different. The savings rate for households is not 4%, it's negative 5%, because you have to include government borrowing in that measure of household savings. The household debt level is not 70% of GDP, it's 190% of GDP, because federal debt is our debt. We don't act that way, we don't think that way, but that's the reality of the situation. We are being held accountable for this. Now, we know this is not sustainable, and the question is only when are we forced to pay the piper? Could be when the Social Security Retirement Fund runs out, could be when the Medicare Trust Fund runs out, maybe when the Highway Trust Fund runs out. But I think it can happen before then. And it can happen largely because of the bubble and interest rates. Look, this comes from the Center for Responsible Federal Budgeting, and this is their estimate of the impact of the One Big Beautiful Bill, the alternative scenario in terms of rising deficits as a percent of the economy. That alternative scenario is based on the tariffs being blown up, and we can no longer collect that money. And you can see how quickly the deficit goes up to about 8% over the course of the next few years. Now, that said, there's something very important in here. This model from the CRFB predicts 4% mortgage, 4% 10-year bond rates going into the future. This has no increase in interest rates built into it. Well, that is not reasonable, because when there's a pile of borrowing, remember, lending markets are just like other markets. When there's less supply and more demand, prices go up. When there's a lot of demand for borrowing and not a lot of supply of it, interest rates go up. Now, this boils down to where the finance or the bubble starts being plugged into this. Look, over the last year and a half, this nation has been privy to an enormous inflow of portfolio investment from the rest of the nation. Massive amounts of money have been pouring into this country. Why? Not to buy government treasuries, but of course to buy AI stock, to buy cryptocurrency, to buy into the bubble, because our bubble has created a situation by which the highest yields that any investor can receive right now are in the U.S. And I know they want to come here because they've been pushing up the dollar higher and higher and higher as they've done it. What happens when the bubble pops and these people decide to take their money elsewhere? Well, the answer is the dollar starts to drop, we have to start self-funding our deficit, and that means an increase in interest rates. Now, I can predict this because I saw it. I saw it last April when we had the panic over the tariffs. I didn't care about the panic on the tariffs, but I sure as hell did care about the panic itself. Because when the panic started, the stock market started to drop. Typically, when the stock market drops, you get a rally in the bond market, interest rates fall. That happened for a couple days, and then it reversed. Suddenly, the bond market started diving, and interest rates started going up. And when you look closely, you also saw the dollar starting to fall. Everything told me that what was happening was the decline in the stock market was causing money to not come here, which meant the bond market was also starting to sag because of the last of the capital. Now, we pulled out of that nosedive, but we have not stopped trying to take other nosedives. Earlier this year, we had the panic over Greenland. Suddenly, yet again, the veneer is coming off, and the dollar is starting to drop. And yes, crypto is starting to drop. And it begs the question, are we yet again going into this particular situation? Is this time when it really comes off, or is this just another head fake, and the economy will start moving forward again? The answer is I don't know. But what I do know is at some point in time, we're going to have to deal with this. At some point in time, the bubble's going to pop, and we're going to come face to face with the problem of the deficit and rising interest rates. And when interest rates start to go up, that's when things get really interesting. Look, it's going to put some pressure on your industry, there's no doubt about it. There's going to be some more issues with debt, there's no doubt about it. But the real scary thing is how this will feed back in terms of government interest payments. We have $40 trillion in outstanding debt. You raise the interest rate on that by 1 percentage point, that's $500 billion a year more in government spending just to deal with higher interest payments. That takes our $2 trillion deficit and turns it into $2.5 trillion. And you can see how that feeds back on itself very, very quickly. And the next thing you know, we are forced into a budget sort of crisis. And they have to deal with the deficit. And there's things they could do. They could go out and just default. Yeah, I think everybody's going to want to avoid that particular depression scenario. The other thing they could do is be responsible and raise taxes and cut spending. Not in this political environment. So the last thing they do is they go to the Federal Reserve and they say, hey man, can you give me a little more quantitative easing? Give me a little breather in the morning. Take a little of the edge off, right? But that quickly, yet again, turns into monetizing the deficit and it leads us to another round of inflation. And that's I wasn't the only person thinking of this. Has anybody else seen the price of gold and silver go up? Now, all of this, of course, went to the point where suddenly, out of the blue, they nominated Kevin Warsh to be the Fed chair. And this guy is the most insider of Wall Street, folks. I mean, this guy came out of the Hoover Institute, for God's sake, right? This would be the guy who would be going against William Jennings Bryan in his Cross of Gold speech. This is a guy who said, suffer on your cross of gold, okay? So the fact that they chose him, I think, is so interesting. The price of gold and silver is going down. But I don't know. It remains to be seen. Where will he go? Where will his loyalties actually lie if we get to this point? Will he really not throw a little money at the economy, or will he stand on his principles and prevent inflation? I don't know. But it certainly was an interesting pick. Maybe it gives us a little more time. Maybe it doesn't. We just don't know. And of course, ultimately, when we have to deal with spending issues, healthcare will be front and center. It is an enormous part of the system. And remember, it's not just that we spend a lot of money, we spend that money incredibly inefficiently. Our healthcare system is a mess, and they're going to start looking at that when that happens. And again, what does that mean for your particular industry? Look, wrapping it all up, what a strange world we live in. When Trump came in office a year ago, he inherited the healthiest U.S. economy ever, and everybody's pissed off and miserable. From an external standpoint, we were completely out of whack, and yet, of course, the financial markets were completely oblivious to it. What a bizarre series of narratives and realities, so far off base from each other, a situation that just can't last. So things are good right now, but there's clearly growing risk in the economy. We know that it's going to hit, at some point in time, it's going to take a hit. Keep aware. Asset bubbles and federal deficits are driving excess consumption. It's simply not sustainable. The foreign inflows of capital chasing that bubble are what preventing us from having a trouble right now, but that's going to stop at some point in time. The popping bubble will create the fiscal crisis, and that is, of course, the next big thing. Now, is it 1 year? Is it 2 years? Is it 5 years? The answer is I don't know. Nobody does. Best part of my job is you got to keep inviting me back to find out. But in the end, remember, it's broken narratives that are our biggest problem of all. It's broken narratives where we believe things that aren't true. that keeps us from pursuing the appropriate policies. It's these stories in the paper, the stories around tables, these are the things preventing us from doing the simple things we need to do to keep this economy growing. Ultimately, that's a problem we all face. Me, you, everybody in this nation. And the question is, how do we get out of that? Remember, it is easier to fool people as they have been fooled, and that is the biggest problem we face. Thank you very much.